So far, the loops we've reviewed have been condition controlled. There's one more loop, the for loop, which is count controlled, meaning it loops a given number of times. Let's learn about the for loop by writing a program for a cashier that will scan a given number of items and tally the cost. I created a new class called cashier, and I've already asked the user how many items that they'd like to scan, and I store that into this variable quantity. Also made a variable called total, and this will hold our total price. So what we need to do now is create a loop that's going to go through however many times they told us to. It's going to get the price of each item and then accumulate that price into this total variable. So that's where a for loop comes in. Again, the for loop is count controlled, meaning it iterates a certain number of times. You write the word for, and then in parentheses, you're going to have three small statements. The very first statement of the for loop initializes a sentinel. So we'll use this as a counter. We'll say int I equals 0, semicolon. In this I is our sentinel. It is a common variable name for an incrementer within the for loop. Also, when we're using loops in programming, it is common to start with the number 0 as opposed to the number 1. So 0 is the first one. The next statement in our for loop is going to be a condition that ends this loop. So we'll say keep looping while I is less than the quantity. So if I is starting at 0, and let's say they enter something like 3, then we'll do 0, 1, 2, and that will be 3, same as the quantity. And then the final statement is we say I plus plus. And the plus plus is going to increment I by 1, because remember, we're using I as a counter. So this will keep track of how many times we have iterated through this loop. And iterate just means gone through the loop. So this final one doesn't take a semicolon. And then we add our curly braces. Now inside of this loop, what are we going to do? We're going to ask the user for the cost of the item, and then we are going to input that, and we're going to add it to our running total. So let me do that part now. Okay, so we've asked them for the item, we have input this in, and then we are adding it to the total. So this again is called an accumulator, where you're basically just continuously adding into another variable. So once we've gotten the total, we are going to print it out. Now we're not going to print this out inside of the loop, because this loop is going to execute multiple numbers of times, and we don't want to keep printing it out unless we were giving a subtotal after each one. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to print the total at the end. All right, so let's go ahead and run it. And we'll say 3 items. So it goes in, asks for the cost of the first item. We'll say $20. As for the cost of the second item, we'll say $30. And then the cost of the final item, we'll say $40. And then it comes outside of the loop, 90. So we knew how many times we wanted to go in. It went and executed exactly those number of times. Here are the key points about the for loop. It's count controlled, meaning it will run a specified number of times. The sentinel is expressed within a condition, which is tested before the loop is entered. And it's best to use when you know how many times the loop should run. Now let's review the steps for the for loop. First, the sentinel is initialized to a starting value, and the ending value is also specified. Then the statements inside of the loop are executed. The condition is rechecked to determine if to run the loop again. So those are the 3 loops, the while, the do while, and the for loop. And we see how they're controlled. But sometimes you may need to get out of a loop regardless of what the condition is. And we can use the break statement for this. Let's do another example so that I can demonstrate this in action. We're going to create a program that searches a string to determine if it contains the letter A. So in this program, I prompted the user to enter some text. I've stored that text within a string, and now we're going to loop through that text to determine if it contains the letter A. So the loop that we're going to use is a for loop again, and we're going to start at I. And in this condition, we're going to say loop until you reach the end of this string. Now, with strings, they have a nice little method here called length. And this is the same number of characters that exist in that string. So we can say keep going until we get to the end of that. And of course, I++ to increment this. Now, inside of this for loop, I'm going to get the letter that we're currently on. So in the first iteration of this loop, we're going to be on the very first letter. So I can say that's going to be a char, and we'll call this current letter equals the text, and you can say char at and give it an index. So char at, we're going to say I. So every time we come through this loop, I will be incremented. So the first time it gets the very first letter, the second time the second letter, third, fourth, and so on. So once we have whatever letter we're working with, we can check to see if that letter equals A. So we can say if current letter equals A, or it might be a lowercase as well. So we'll add that condition as well. So if it's A, then we can update a variable called letter found. And let's go ahead and define this variable here. So we can say Boolean letter found, and let's initialize this to false because the letter has not been found. And then we'll search through this string. And if we find the letter, we're going to update letter found to be true. And then here's the key. Once I found that this letter is true, let's say that they've entered this long text of 100 characters and the second letter was an A. There's no reason I should still let this loop continue until the very end because I already know that it contains A. So to be efficient, we want to get out of this loop once we find it. So we can use this keyword, break. And break will end the loop. It will break outside of this loop. Doesn't matter what iteration it's on. So we're on the second iteration and we find it. We're going to come outside of this loop and we're going to continue on with the program. And at this point, let's go ahead and let them know if we found the letter. Okay, great. Let's run it. But I'm going to use a debugger. In your code editor, there's usually a debugger. So in IntelliJ, there's definitely one. And you can use it to stop at any point within your execution of your program. So I want to stop it right after we get what the current letter is. So at this line, I'm simply going to click it, and that adds what's called a breakpoint. And when your program is executing, once it gets here, it'll stop and give you information about everything here. So to run this in debug mode, instead of clicking the play button, you're going to click this bug icon, which is debug. So I'm going to run this, and it's asking for some text. So let's say we're going to say beach, where A is the third letter. So now the program is executed and is stopped at this point. Notice right here is giving us all of this information. So the text is beach. The letter found is false. I is currently on 0, meaning the first one. And the current letter we're looking at is B. Now to continue through this program, we can use these little tools right here. This is saying go to the next step. So we're going to evaluate that if, that's where it was on, that was false. So it came back to the top of this for loop. And now we see that it's updating I. And then the current letter is now E. Now we're on the if statement. This is also going to be false, so it's going to go back to the top of the loop. Now we see that the current letter is A. Now it's going to do this condition. Notice it's true, so it went inside of this. We update letter found to true. Now we're going to break outside of the loop, never going back in for the fourth letter. Yes. So now we're outside of our for loop, and we don't need to debug anymore. We just want to run it all, so we can click this to say resume, and then back to the console here, and it says, yep, this text contains the letter A.